More importantly, I think you have to say to them that, I'm sure your grandfather believed that, and I'm sure he told you this truthfully. I'm not saying your grandfather was a liar, but I am saying that your grandfather was in a particular place in history, and his understanding of it was pretty limited. And we don't have to necessarily perpetuate your grandfather's ideas about history. We can see it's more complicated.
That's the voice of Dr. Alex Wellerstein, assistant professor at Stevens Institute of Technology and renowned nuclear historian. He's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Collina.
Welcome back to the 66th episode of Press the Button and day, I don't even know what, of the heat wave here on the East Coast. Tom, how are you doing?
Hey, Michelle, I'm doing great. I'm actually in a cabin in the woods in southern New Hampshire. So I'm really enjoying being out of the urban heat. And it's a great escape from not only the heat, but the whole COVID-19 situation.
Indeed. And I am coming to you from a closet in New Haven, Connecticut, where I am at least able to hide from the heat. Tom, what do you have lined up for us today on Early Warning?
We have a great interview with Elizabeth Beavers, and she's talking about a very important vote we're expecting in the Senate next week on a 10% cut to Pentagon spending. This will be a very important vote to see where the federal budget debate is going in the wake of COVID-19, the economy, and the racial injustice movement that we're seeing. So you won't want to miss it.
Fantastic. And it's also an important week for other reasons. This Thursday marks the 75th anniversary of the Trinity test, the world's first nuclear explosion that took place on July 16, 1945. I invited nuclear historian Dr. Alex Wellerstein to discuss how the history we learn in school matches up to what really happened and how these beliefs and these mismatches in our beliefs shape our concept of warfare today. It was an eye-opening conversation that I think gives really important context to this anniversary.
And as always, click that subscribe button and give the show a rating if you're enjoying it. If you believe nuclear issues like the ones we discuss are not receiving the coverage they deserve, then you can help us elevate the issue by sharing Press the Button with your family and friends.
With that said, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thank you, Del, and welcome back to Early Warning. This is an important week. Of course, it's the 75th anniversary of the first nuclear test, which we'll hear more about later in the show. But it's also an important moment for a long overdue national debate over federal budget priorities. And with us to discuss this is Elizabeth Beavers. She's a progressive foreign policy strategist working with Public Citizen. Elizabeth, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
She is working with a coalition of progressive groups for a 10% reduction in Pentagon spending. This effort is led in the Senate by Senator Sanders and by Representatives Barbara Lee and Mark Pocan in the House. And we're expecting a vote as early as next week, which we'll talk about soon. To me, this is a completely reasonable response to the coronavirus pandemic, the struggling economy, and racial injustice that all of this has exposed. It's also a great way to put pressure on excessive nuclear weapons spending inside the Pentagon. Because as we know, when military leaders are forced to choose between conventional weapons and nuclear, they tend to choose conventional weapons. Just a couple of facts on this. The proposed spending on defense this year comes in at a whopping $740 billion. And this is more than the levels spent by the next 10 nations combined and higher than expenditures during the peak of the Korean and Vietnam wars. So with that, Elizabeth, a lot of people think that these efforts sort of pop up out of nowhere. But of course, as we know, this is, I'm sure, months and years of efforts by dedicated organizers like yourself to bring these issues to public attention. Tell us where this effort has come from.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, folks have been working for a very, very long time, way before me, on redirecting our federal spending priorities away from weapons of war towards community human needs. Public Citizen stepped up its involvement around this time last year, particularly with an eye to the presidential primary process. We organized a coalition of groups, more than 25 national progressive organizations that were urging the primary candidates to talk with specificity with plans for big, bold cuts to the Pentagon budget and talking about what could we have, what could we do with that same money. And so we actually saw some success on that during the primary process. Several candidates had those conversations, started introducing those ideas. And the whole point is just to make it more palatable, more safe politically, particularly among the political left, to go after the Pentagon budget and to imagine what we could do with our resources instead. So we're really excited to see this happening on the Hill now. This really is quite a modest cut when it comes to some of the other proposals that are out there. Our coalition actually called for $200 billion per year in cuts. The Poor People's Campaign has called for $350 billion in cuts. The Sustainable Defense Task Force has called for 100. There are all kinds of proposals out there, but the point is that there is a lot ripe for cutting. There are also a lot of underfunded needs, as we're seeing very, very clearly at this moment in our history right now. So it's tone deaf to not actually talk about it and not try to do something about it. So we're very excited.
Completely agree. Now, this bill, as you say, is a relatively modest bill. It would cut about $74 billion from the current proposal. And it would redirect that funding to some of the poorest communities in the country. Is that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So this is about a 10% across the board cut that's been proposed both in the House and the Senate. And for procedural reasons, the House isn't exactly able to take the same approach. But on the Senate side, Senator Sanders' amendment talks about reinvesting that money that's cut. And I should note that this is a cut that exempts personnel, exempts defense health programs, and takes that money and redirects it into communities with high levels of poverty. It's exactly the right kind of step, because rather than just talking about how big the Pentagon budget is, we should talk about our imagination, our vision of what this country could look like if we redirected those resources.
Now, I imagine you were surprised by Senator Schumer's support. What do you think he's thinking in this regard?
Yes, surprised to say the least. I think that he's picking up on winds of change. There's a strong, proud, bipartisan tradition of giving presidents, Republican and Democrat, basically whatever they want when it comes to defense spending, so-called defense spending, giving the Pentagon what they want, being afraid to look, quote unquote, weak on national security. It's just something that very few members have really been meaningfully willing to take on and to confront. But there's clearly a grassroots movement. There's a multi-sector interest in seeing our resources being distributed in a different way. It comes on the heels of the conversation around defunding the police. What could our communities look like if there wasn't so much money spent on the use of force and systems of violence? What if we were investing in root causes and healthcare and education and everything else that actually meets our human needs? And I think that slowly members of Congress are waking up to the fact you have environmental justice groups, you have anti-poverty organizations, immigrant rights groups, multi-issue progressive movement orgs. Everybody is signing on in support of this amendment. And it's just sort of inescapable right now not to pick up on what's happening. So it's a huge surprise, but it's a very, very welcome one.
Now, I'm struck by the leadership position in the Senate versus what the House Democratic leadership is doing. Are you hoping that the Democratic leadership in the House will take a different tack as a result?
Well, I'd like to say that they aren't explicitly supportive yet, but there's a lot of pressure ongoing from this coalition of groups who are supporting. And you know, I'm very hopeful that they will understand that really our political moment is changing. It's very sort of old school to be so afraid of going after militarism and going after military contractors. It's more and more research. Another organization I work with all the time, Brown University's Cost of War Project, they've put out all this reporting on where the dollars go, how our job market could be way better if we didn't hinge our entire economy on war and fossil fuels. There's just new ideas out there, and there are people hungry for them. So, we've done polling that shows a majority of voters actually find this to be a popular idea, moving money from the Pentagon to our domestic human needs. And so I'm very, very hopeful that members of Congress will slowly start to catch on.
Elizabeth, with that, our time is up. I want to thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all your efforts working with your partners to push this effort ahead. Again, thanks for your time.
Thanks to you all.
Today, I'm thrilled to welcome back to the podcast Dr. Alex Wellerstein, an assistant professor at the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey. Assistant professor describes almost the least of what he does. He is a nuclear historian. You've definitely seen his research, probably played around with NUKEMAP. And you've seen his quotes in The New Yorker, NPR, Times, Fox News, Radiolab, so many places that you can think of. And he is also a repeat guest. The atomic bomb is now 75 years old, and Alex was the first person I thought of to talk with how the history matches up to the stories we tell ourselves about nuclear weapons and how we feel the echoes of these anniversaries today. Alex, welcome back to the show.
I'm really glad to be here, Michelle.
So July 16th marks the 75th anniversary of the Trinity test, when the U.S. detonated a plutonium implosion device in the desert in New Mexico, the world's first nuclear explosion. And while it was the first nuclear explosion, the device was actually not even the same as what was eventually dropped on Hiroshima less than a month later. And that was a gun-type weapon fueled by uranium. So in your view, how does the popular narrative of the Trinity test hold up to what you found in historical accounts and through your research? Is there a real story of Trinity?
So Trinity is interesting. It plays a very different role in our understanding of the atomic bombs than, say, like Hiroshima does, right? So Trinity is the sort of technical accomplishment that everybody can get behind, right? And so in all the stories, it's always like, we've got to get it working. We've got to get, the science experiment succeeded. And then there's this kind of segue to, now we're going to kill tens of thousands of people. And for the people involved, there is that disconnect as well. Many of them did see Trinity as this sort of large-scale experiment, and good data and all that was very important. But many of them, in focusing on something like Trinity, were able to not focus on what these things are actually to be used for. And there's many accounts of these scientists who were sort of ecstatic about the Trinity test results, but then had this sort of come down when they realized, oh God, what is this thing going to do? What's that going to do if you put that on people? One of the things I think is often misunderstood about Trinity, though, in a lot of these narratives, one of the hard things in studying history, when you know the outcome of something, it's hard to feel the same sort of tension that people had at the time. It's the same thing in watching a television show or a movie in which there's going to be a sequel. So the guy isn't going to get killed, right? That he's going to survive. And so you lose a little bit of that investment when he's in the sequel. Similarly with Trinity, it's usually portrayed as this sort of buildup and then this sort of triumph that comes at the end of the buildup. It's the sort of light at the end of the tunnel. And in its actual context, it's a bit more desperate than that. They really weren't sure it was going to work. They really were not expecting it to work as well as it did. We know, most people probably listening to this know that the bomb dropped on Hiroshima was a little bit smaller in explosive yield than the one dropped on Nagasaki and Trinity, 15 kilotons to 20 or something along those lines. That was not their expectation at all. They thought Trinity was more likely to be 5 kilotons. They all, up until Trinity, referred to the little boy bomb as the big bomb. They thought that was going to be the guaranteed big explosive, and they thought implosion was probably not going to work that well. And what Trinity did was rapidly shift their understanding of what they had made. The problem with the little boy bombs was supply. They only had the one. Their production rates could make maybe one bomb every 2 months of that sort. And they thought, well, we'll have these big bombs every couple of months, and then we'll have all these little tiny bombs that are still big bombs, but are more comparable to, they're not the same order of magnitude. They're maybe half as damaging as the little boy bomb would have been. And then that rapidly shifted, and they realized, no, we're going to have big bombs, and we're going to have maybe 3 of those a month. And this is a different view of the atomic bomb. This is a different level of attack possibility and things like that. So the other thing that Trinity did have a big effect on, and this is in some of the histories, but I think people underestimated a bit, Trinity was when Truman and many of his high commanders started taking the atomic bomb seriously. Until they knew it worked, it was this sort of abstract thing. But after that, it became this sort of impetus to be a little bit more belligerent towards the Soviets. They could be tougher, this more confidence that the war was going to be ending pretty soon, one way or the other. So it had a huge impact on the sort of foreign relations aspect. And the fact that Truman only sort of hinted at it to Stalin, told Stalin that Truman wasn't totally playing totally straight up with him, that he knew that Truman was holding a lot back. So there's a lot going on in Trinity.
So stepping back from the history itself, I was really struck by something that you wrote in a recent post on your blog, that Americans in particular use the atomic bombings as a shorthand for thinking about vitally important present-day issues like the ends justifying the means, who the appropriate targets of war are, and the use of force in general. So how do we get beyond the shorthand?
I think, and it's over time, it's become increasingly clear the more people I talk to about the atomic bomb, and the more I look at the sort of resistances I get to when you tell people how historians regard this, and you get this pushback. And I've been looking more and more at the pushback. It's not totally different from all these conversations people are having right now about Confederate monuments and Columbus and all of that sort of stuff, where you have a sort of symbolic history that people learn as children. And that history is used for a very specific purpose. It might be to instill a sense of pride or a sense of meaning about themselves. Like, there's all these things that people have misunderstood, but they hold on to them because it's this sort of familiar narrative, and it's one that tells us who we are and what kind of people we are. And the fact that it's totally wrong is one, telling about what kind of people we are, but makes it very hard to dislodge. With the atomic bombings, the comparable thing is people like to think about the atomic bomb for thinking about how wars end. They like to think about them in terms of, like, what are you allowed to do in the time of war? If you kill X number of people, but you save X times 10, is it allowable? This kind of stuff has led Americans since World War II to be very supportive of policies that have been pretty bad for the country, for the idea that, oh, this war will be really easy. We'll just bomb them a bunch and it'll be over in a week, which no war has ever ended that way. Even World War II didn't end that way. Even if you think the atomic bombs ended the war, it didn't. It was still on top of years of other things and boots on the ground and all that kind of stuff. How do you dislodge it? I think a start is to dislodge the history a little bit. And I've been working now for several years and thinking about how to do that in a way that doesn't just get the knee-jerk response. Because if I go to somebody and say, well, the atomic bombs weren't necessarily necessary to end the war, or, Hiroshima and Nagasaki are not necessarily valid targets, depending on how you go about it, or even things like, even things that are just true, but people are confused by, like, they didn't warn the Japanese before they dropped the atomic bombs on them, which is a myth many people believe in. You get a huge amount of pushback. And the pushback is usually of, like, it's not of a, like, learned form. It's along the lines of, well, my grandfather told me that if they hadn't dropped the atomic bombs, that he was slated to begin the invasion of Japan. And so I would be dead if the atomic bombs hadn't happened. And that's not like a historical statement, right? That's somebody told me this, somebody I cared about told me this, and they told me that my own life was tied up in this one view of this history. And that's hard to dislodge. And if you just say, well, Grandpa was wrong, people don't respond or react well to that, right? Understandably. I found it helps a little bit. One, it helps if you can do this in person because people are jerks on the internet, and as you know, and it's hard to get people to rethink things and be empathetic. But you could say to somebody, especially if you can look them eye to eye, and say, "Look, I get that your grandpa thought that. Like he was told that. He was told that by the government. There's a reason he was told that by the government. He was told that by the government because they were justifying using the atomic bombs." If you look at the actual facts of it, one, the invasion was not slated till November, so it wasn't like he was on the next boat. There's some time there for all sorts of stuff to happen, and historians have argued about the kinds of things that could have happened in that time. But there's been a lot of people, including since 1945, who did not think that an invasion was going to happen no matter what, because the combination of atomic bombs and the Soviet invasion of Japan, and Japan being on the last ropes anyway, and their blockaded harbors, and just the threat and all this kind of stuff, like makes it not super likely that an invasion of the home islands was likely to occur. And you don't have to believe me on that. You can believe the military analysts from the time, right? But more importantly, I think you have to say to them that, you know, I'm sure your grandfather believed that, and I'm sure he told you this truthfully. I'm not saying your grandfather was a liar, but I am saying that your grandfather was in a particular place in history, and his understanding of it was pretty limited. And we don't have to necessarily perpetuate your grandfather's ideas about history. We can see it's more complicated, but always being empathetic to the grandfather, right? Being like, no, I get why your grandfather thought that, but we're beyond that now. We have a lot more information than your grandfather had, and we can rethink some of these things that your grandfather believed. I find that somewhat opens the door, but it's not perfect.
What are the top myths or commonly held beliefs that you really wish that people would question or reflect on this summer? Sure. I mean, there's a lot of myths, and some of them are in the category of myths that drive me crazy, but probably aren't worth taking the time to slay every time. Like, one of the most persistent myths on the internet is that Japan was warned about the atomic bomb, so that we dropped leaflets on Hiroshima, and this is just misunderstands the whole atomic bombing operation, which was meant to be a surprise, but also is like mixed up with other understandings and about the atomic bombs, and sometimes just misunderstandings about documents and things like this. And the reality is so much more screwball that I'm not surprised people don't believe it. But we did make leaflets to talk about the atomic bombs after Hiroshima, and we were going to drop them on Nagasaki, in fact, but they screwed up the timing, and so they dropped them after they had already been atomic bombed. And so, like, that's the kind of thing you wouldn't put that in a movie. It sounds too stupid, but, you know, war is complicated, and the atomic bomb operations and the leaflet operations were two separate tracks that were not coordinating with one another. So there you go. So that's the kind of thing that annoys me, because people use that to sort of justify the atomic bombings, and they're using a totally fake thing to justify them. And there are ways rational people can decide they were on balance justified or had to happen or whatever. But, you know, don't base it on a totally fake thing. Historians have known these are myths for a long time. This isn't me coming at you with some wacky theory of history or something. This is like boring stuff for historians. But like, there was no decision to make the atomic bomb. That whole way of framing it as Truman weighed whether he should invade or make a decision and saving these lives versus those lives, and finally he made the fateful. No, it didn't happen. Never happened. We've really conclusively established that by looking at the documentary record and looking at how it made. There were lots of little tiny decisions made along the way, but pretty much everybody assumed they were going to use the bomb, and it never really came into any kind of deliberation. The idea was you had a weapon, you were going to use it. And you can hate that or like that or support that or whatever, but the idea that it was this pitched deliberation, that was created in the post-war to make the whole thing sound more rationalized and to make it seem more streamlined and sort of defensible and things like that. The other one that always stands out to me is the myth that the only options were bomb or invade. And this one I think is particularly insidious because it's a myth created by the people who dropped the atomic bombs afterwards when it came under criticism. And it's a very clever rhetorical trap. Because if you get into the discussion of which was worse, a full land-scale invasion against the home islands of Japan, or what happened to the atomic bombings, you can easily imagine,
that the home island invasion would be this awful, terrible thing, because it probably would have been if you had that kind of situation. And the fact that it didn't happen means you can also imagine whatever you want. You can take Okinawa numbers and apply them to Japan as a whole and end up with these huge numbers. And for whatever it's worth, the military at the time didn't think that was necessarily what it was going to be. They thought Okinawa and Iwo Jima, these were pretty specific situations, and they thought that there would be a sort of different conditions if they invaded the home islands. But whatever, they didn't know either, right? They didn't do it. So because it's didn't happen, you can inflate those numbers and the severity of that as much as you want. And so that makes it basically impossible not to conclude that the atomic bombs were the better choice. And it's a way to lock you in. If you instead say, well, here's 4 or 5 different approaches. Here's one. What if they just waited till after the Soviet invasion to see what the Japanese were doing, right? That would have involved waiting a week, maybe. We know that they and the Soviets and the Japanese all thought the Soviet invasion was a major turning point. We could have waited. We could have waited and then used one bomb and then waited. Or we could have used a bomb on a basically uninhabited area or someplace very low inhabited or something like that. We could have used it not against a city, but against some sort of isolated military base. We could have used one and then waited a week or two, not 3 days, so that the Japanese had time to assess what had happened and then done it. If you start offering up these possibilities, you can argue about which of them sounds more plausible to you or which of them sounds better, but you're not as locked into this invasion thing. And the other reason I hate it is because this was not how anybody saw it. Nobody saw it as bomb versus invasion. Again, the decision idea is totally bunk. But if you can unlock that a little bit, then people feel more comfortable to say, well, I don't really know if the way it happened, 2 atomic bombs on 2 cities in 3 days, is the most just or strategic or whatever have you approach. It keeps you from falling into that trap. So these are, for me, the kinds of decisions that I think are big enough myths. The separate one and the last one is just that historians don't really know exactly what caused the end of World War II. And it's a lot more complicated than bombs went off, war ended, right? The Soviets played a role. Internal Japanese tensions played a role. There's so much going on in this very small amount of time. Did the atomic bombs contribute? Maybe. The Hiroshima bomb had some impact. It's not clear the Nagasaki bomb did at all. But in any event, just the fact that there's a lot of confusion on that, to me, is an important thing to emphasize to non-historians, because it's often presented as if it's this like cut and dry thing. And the fact that there's so much murkiness over this sort of foundational question, how did World War II end, that has a lot of implications for how you might think about other wars. For example, World War II is basically the only war that anybody has claimed was ended by aerial bombing. And even that's not clear that the aerial bombing ended the war. But if that's the only war in which it happened, you should not even then be confident that aerial bombing would end any other war. And yet Americans are very keen to believe that, if we just bomb the heck out of this country, they'll give us what we want. And that is the history of warfare. That's basically never happened. If it did happen, the atomic bombs would be the only time it happened. And it's not clear it is what happened there.
So, you've already brought us to the present day of how wars are fought, how they end, if they end. I was really struck that as we enter this anniversary year, nuclear testing is back in the news for reasons that have nothing to do with an anniversary. The Trump administration has reportedly considered whether to conduct a test to send a political message to China and Russia. And if that happened, it would be the first time in over 30 years. And so I'm curious, as you look at what is happening now with this lens of history, how do these reasons match up to those of years past? And do you see things that have changed about the calculus now, or are they still operating under this framework?
So what I find most troubling about the developments today is that people sort of take the quote-unquote technical justifications for a test at face value. And during the Cold War, I think people started to develop a little bit more, I don't want to say skepticism because there were a lot of testing, but a little more skepticism. Of course, a scientist who works at a weapons lab is going to come up with a good reason for a test if they have to, right? That's their job. And they're very clever people. And if you want to say well, this little bit of data would be useful to have, and then tie that somehow vaguely into a national security mission, you can do it if you want to. And what we saw at the end of the Cold War was basically the scientists eventually coming around to the idea that, we could probably actually get most of that data from some very expensive machines. The National Ignition Facility, the DART facility at Los Alamos, right? There were these sort of big expenditures made and huge amounts of expenditures in supercomputing and simulation so that we can understand these things to a certain level of confidence, right? Is it going to be total confidence? No, but testing doesn't give you total confidence either. Testing just allows you to shave off certain aspects of that. And now it feels like when I talk to people about the new testing, either you have people who think it's all a terrible idea, which I think is actually true, but or see it as 100% political, which is clearly what most of it is, right? No offense, but if you think that the president is really concerned with, the confidence level of the secondaries in a new warhead, no, right? It's not likely, right? He doesn't know what a secondary is, right? But there certainly are people who have been associated with the national security infrastructure and probably even the labs who are willing to say, oh, yes, no, this is not about politics. It's because we need this thing here and we'll learn this little bit of stuff about this warhead and we need to make sure that this is right. And I think we need to be skeptical of those things and be willing to say, look, if you don't have total confidence that this thing will be exactly the yield you think it'll be, who cares, right? If you have enough confidence that enough of these weapons are going to work, it's going to work for your strategic purposes. If you think Russia is sitting over there thinking, they're not sure how the secondary is going to work, it could be 10% lower than they expect, right? They're not going to make a strategic decision. Now we can take Ukraine, right? It's not going to happen, right? That's not how states have ever acted. This is how sort of very imaginative scientists imagine states act so that they can get support for these things. I think it would be a real tragedy. We've seen from the history of nuclear testing that it's a lot easier to start up testing than it is to get everybody to stop it again. It took an immense amount of work to get the not just the U.S. and Russia to stop testing, which they were able to do, but to finally get the French and the Chinese on board with that. We've set up a system in which testing is still not a norm anymore, so that when North Korea sets up a test, everybody can condemn them and say, hey, man, don't do that. If we start testing again, it's hard for me not to see everybody else saying, well, if they do it, then why can't we do it? Russia certainly is going to have to. They wouldn't. What kind of state would they be? If Russia started overtly testing, we would probably do it too, right? That's part of the reason we don't do it. So anyway, I feel like there's, I guess what my some feeling of this is all of that testing that we did was in the service of building a lot of weapons. And the relationship between the testing and the weapon development was a very close one. If you restart testing now, you're going to restart it in a lot of places, I'm betting. And you're also going to restart a lot more weapon development, warhead development. We've managed to sort of freeze warhead development. That's not frozen the arms race at all. There's plenty of other places to innovate. I don't think we need to reopen that can of worms and add yet another dimension. But, that's just me. Hey, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
How did they teach you about the atomic bombing when you were in, say, high school?
So I grew up near the Hanford site. And so the story was that it probably ended the war. There were some questions. But I guess I was also a little more familiar in some ways with some of the disagreements because, as you know, Richland High, one of the local high schools, mascot is the Bombers because they created the plutonium for the device. And about every 5 years, we get a Japanese delegation who'd come over and say, this is really offensive. This killed a lot of people. And also in the background, in the city, you'd hear conversations of what was the impact of this production program on the site? What about the burping tank still out at Hanford? And what is the legacy left with us today? But it ran straight up against a very patriotic sense of this is what we did to save the world, and we're very proud of it. But it's still, in some ways, maybe a contested narrative, even at one of the Manhattan Project sites.
I suspect it's probably more contested there than it would have been. I grew up in a place that had no connection whatsoever to the Manhattan Project. And I suspect because you have the Japanese delegation, because you have the Hanford bombers, it probably made these things much more acute. Whereas if you're not connected to a place like that, it's more of an abstraction, right? That's really interesting. Thanks.
No, thank you. And I really appreciate you coming back on the podcast for a second round. Where can listeners go if they want to learn more about your research?
Oh, well, you can go to my website, my blog. If you go to nuclearsecrecy.com for all your nuclear secrecy needs, you'll find that. And you'll find out about my book, which is coming out early 2021 on the history of nuclear secrecy.
Alex, thanks so much for joining.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced by Delphine Vigil, Zach Brown, Derek Zender, and Will Lowry. Sound design by Derek Zender. Audio engineering by Derek Zender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.